There is a silence that only exists in the Appalachian Mountains during January. It is not the silence of absence. It is something heavier, something ancient, the kind of quiet that presses down on the chest and makes a person understand, in a way no book ever could, just how alone a family could be in those hills. Snow would fall for days without stopping. The temperature would sink well below zero. The wind would move through the hollows like something alive, pushing against the walls of cabins that had no insulation by modern standards, no double-pane glass, no central heating, no backup plan. And yet, morning after morning, families woke up. Fires were already burning. The water had not frozen inside the house. Corn was still edible in the cellar. The family was still alive. That is what this story is about. Not the cold, but the intelligence that survived it. The Appalachian mountain range stretches across 14 states, from Alabama up through New York, covering some of the most rugged and geographically complex terrain in the eastern United States. The ridgelines rise and fall sharply, creating isolated coves and hollows that were, for many generations, effectively cut off from the rest of the country. Roads were poor or non-existent. Rivers flooded without warning. In winter, entire communities could go weeks without contact with neighboring settlements. What happened inside those hollows stayed there. And what was learned inside those hollows was learned the hard way. Through failure, through observation, through the accumulated knowledge of people who could not afford to be wrong. By the mid-1800s, many of the families living deep in the Appalachian highlands had been there for generations. They were largely of Scots-Irish and English descent. People whose ancestors had come to America seeking land and found it in the mountains, where no one else particularly wanted to go. They built their homesteads in the coves, near streams, at elevations that offered some shelter from the wind, but still allowed for farming on the narrow benches of flat ground. And every single year, without exception, winter came for them with a particular kind of severity that flatland dwellers simply never experienced. A winter storm in the southern Appalachians was not just snow. It was a combination of sleet, ice, plummeting temperatures, and wind that came down off the ridges in gusts capable of stripping bark from trees. Temperatures in some of the high-elevation valleys regularly dropped to -15 and -20 degrees Fahrenheit during the coldest stretches of winter, sometimes for weeks at a time. Snow could accumulate to depths of 3 and 4 feet in the hollows, where it drifted and compressed and became nearly impossible to move by hand. Livestock had to be managed, water sources kept from freezing, food supplies maintained, and fires kept burning, all simultaneously, by families working with nothing more than what they had built, grown, or preserved by their own hands. The cabin itself was the first line of survival, and the construction of it reflected an understanding of heat and airflow that most modern people have never had to think about. Appalachian cabins were not simple boxes. They were carefully considered structures, built according to principles that had been tested and refined over generations. The logs used for the walls were typically hewn flat on 2 sides, which allowed them to fit together more tightly at the joints. But tightness alone was never enough against a mountain winter. The real work was in the chinking, the material packed into the gaps between the logs to seal out wind and cold. Mountain families used a variety of substances depending on what was available. Clay mixed with dried grass or animal hair, crushed limestone combined with ash, even strips of bark pressed into the gaps and sealed over with a clay paste. The result was a wall that, when properly maintained, was surprisingly resistant to drafts. A poorly chinked cabin was a cold cabin. A well-chinked one was something else entirely. The placement of the fireplace was not accidental. In most Appalachian cabins, the fireplace and chimney were built into an end wall, typically constructed from riverstone or dry-stacked fieldstone mortared with clay. The stone held heat for hours after a fire died down, acting as a thermal mass that continued radiating warmth into the room long after the flames were low. This was not a concept families learned from a textbook. It was something observed and understood through experience. On the coldest nights, The fire would be built up high before sleep, and by morning, the stone of the chimney would still be warm to the touch. That residual heat, added to the body warmth of a family sleeping in a small space, could keep the interior temperature of a well-built one-room cabin survivable even when the outdoor temperature had plunged far below freezing. But surviving winter was never just about one thing. It was a system, and every part of it had to work. The location of the cabin within the landscape was chosen with enormous care. Families who had been in the mountains for more than one generation knew which hollows held cold air and which ones drained it. Cold air, like water, flows downhill and pools in low places. A cabin built in the bottom of a narrow hollow might be 20 degrees colder on a still, clear night than a cabin built 50 feet higher on the slope, simply because the cold air draining off the ridges settled into the low ground like a liquid. The families who understood this chose their building sites accordingly. They looked for spots that had good southern exposure, so the sun, even at its low winter angle, would strike the cabin walls and roof for as many hours as possible during the day. They looked for sites protected from the northwest wind, which was where the worst weather came from in those mountains. A ridge or a stand of old growth trees to the northwest was worth more than almost anything else in terms of winter warmth. The construction of the roof was another area where mountain people demonstrated extraordinary practical intelligence. Metal roofing was not widely available or affordable in the region until well into the 20th century. Before that, mountain cabins were roofed primarily with hand-riven wooden shingles, split from straight-grained chestnut or oak, and laid in overlapping rows that shed water and snow effectively. The pitch of the roof was steep for good reason. A steep-pitched roof shed snow before it could accumulate to dangerous weight. It also created a substantial attic space, and that space was not wasted. It trapped warm air that rose from the room below, creating an additional insulating layer between the living space and the cold outside. Families often stuffed that attic space with dried leaves, straw, or corn husks, materials that added even more insulation and helped stabilize the temperature in the room below. The floor of the cabin presented its own challenge. Ground temperature in winter, even in the mountains, stays relatively stable, hovering around 50 degrees a few feet below the surface. But the air directly above the ground in an uninsulated space can be bitterly cold, and a family living on bare dirt or poorly sealed wooden planks would lose an enormous amount of body heat simply through the floor. The most common solution was layering. Woven rag rugs were placed over every inch of usable floor space. Animal hides, particularly those of bear or deer, were laid over the rugs in the coldest areas of the room. Straw was sometimes stuffed beneath the floorboards where access allowed, creating a rough but effective buffer against the cold earth below. Children who slept on pallets on the floor were given the heaviest quilts and placed nearest the fireplace, always with layers of fabric between their bodies and the planks. The quilts themselves deserved their own consideration, because they were not merely blankets. They were engineering projects, constructed over months or years by the women of the household, pieced together from every scrap of usable fabric and stuffed with cotton batting, wool fleece, or in some cases layers of worn clothing that had been cut into strips and compressed. A well-made Appalachian quilt was an exceptionally effective insulating garment, capable of trapping enough body heat to keep a person comfortable at temperatures that would otherwise be dangerous. Families often slept under multiple quilts during the deepest cold spells, and the weight alone, which could reach 15 or 20 pounds for a full sleeping stack, provided its own psychological sense of security. Water was one of the most pressing and constant challenges of an Appalachian winter. Spring water, collected from sources above the cabin, was preferred because a strong spring flowing at sufficient volume would rarely freeze at the source, the constant movement keeping ice from forming. But the run from the spring to the cabin, along wooden troughs or clay pipes, or simply an open channel cut into the hillside, could freeze completely on the coldest nights, leaving the family without running water until it thawed. Every family kept barrels and clay crocks of water stored inside the cabin specifically for this contingency. They would fill these vessels every day the water was running, knowing that a cold snap could cut them off at any moment. The discipline of preparation was not something anyone had to be taught after their first winter without water. It was something learned quickly and never forgotten. Food storage was, in many ways, the most complex and important element of winter survival. And the solutions that mountain families developed over generations represented some of the most sophisticated low-technology food preservation systems ever devised outside of an urban industrial context. The root cellar was the centerpiece of it all. Dug into the hillside, often directly beneath or adjacent to the cabin, the root cellar took advantage of the same principle that makes springs reliable in winter. Underground temperature is stable, below the frost line, which in the Appalachians varied from 2 to 4 feet depending on elevation and location. The Earth maintains a temperature that hovers between 35 and 50 degrees year-round, cold enough to slow the biological processes that cause food to decay, warm enough to prevent most vegetables from freezing. A well-built Appalachian root cellar was a remarkable piece of functional engineering. The walls were typically stone, dry stacked, or mortared, which absorbed and released heat slowly enough to buffer the interior temperature against outside swings. The floor was bare earth or gravel, which allowed humidity to remain high enough to prevent root vegetables from desiccating. The door was heavy, often double-layered with a small airlock space between, and faced north or east to minimize heat gain in warmer months. Inside, families stored turnips, sweet potatoes, Irish potatoes, cabbages, dried beans, dried corn, pickled vegetables in crocks, cured meat wrapped in cloth or packed in salt, dried herbs, and in some cases, living rootstock planted in boxes of earth that would keep producing small amounts of fresh food through the winter months. The preservation of meat was a practice so essential to winter survival that it shaped the entire rhythm of the fall season. Hog killing time, typically in November after the first hard frost had killed off the flies and cooled the air sufficiently to prevent rapid spoilage, was not just a farm task. It was a community event. Neighbors came together to help process an animal that might weigh 300 pounds or more, working quickly to separate the various cuts and begin the preservation process before the meat could spoil. The hams and shoulders, the largest and most prized cuts, were rubbed with a heavy coat of salt and sometimes brown sugar, then hung in the smokehouse for weeks of slow curing over a fire made from hickory or apple wood. The smoke served multiple purposes simultaneously. It deposited chemical compounds on the surface of the meat that inhibited bacterial growth. It dried the surface layer, creating a barrier that slowed moisture loss from the interior, and it flavored the meat in a way that had become so deeply associated with mountain cooking that it was considered, by many families, to be inseparable from the taste of home itself. The fat from the hog was rendered into lard, which was poured into stone crocks and stored in the root cellar. It served as the primary cooking fat for the entire winter, used for frying, for making biscuits and cornbread, for seasoning beans, and in some cases for waterproofing leather goods and lubricating wooden tools. The intestines were cleaned and used as casings for sausage, mixed with salt, sage, red pepper, and black pepper, and twisted into links that were then smoked alongside the hams. The organs, which would not preserve as well as the larger cuts, were eaten in the days immediately following the kill. Nothing was wasted, not the blood, which went into blood pudding, not the feet, which were pickled in brine, not the head, which was boiled down for souse or head cheese. The philosophy of complete utilization was not an aesthetic choice. It was necessity expressed as culture. Dried beans were another critical pillar of the winter diet, and the varieties grown and saved by Appalachian families represented an agricultural heritage that stretched back centuries. Mountain families cultivated dozens of distinct varieties of shell beans, each with slightly different characteristics in terms of flavor, storage life, and cooking time. These beans were grown through the summer, allowed to dry on the vine in the fall, shelled by hand, and stored in cloth sacks or wooden boxes in the root cellar or the driest corner of the cabin loft, combined with salt pork or a smoked ham hock and cooked long and slow over the fireplace. They provided a meal that was high in protein, complex carbohydrates, and calories, Exactly what bodies working hard in cold weather required. Cornmeal, ground from dried field corn at the local mill, or at home on a small hand mill, was the other great staple. Cornbread baked in a cast iron skillet or Dutch oven directly in the coals of the fireplace required nothing more than cornmeal, salt, lard, and a small amount of water or buttermilk. It could be made quickly, required no yeast or rising time, and could sustain a person through a full day of hard physical labor in cold weather. The cast iron cookware itself was one of the most important technologies in the mountain household. Not because it was sophisticated, but because it was so extraordinarily durable and versatile. A single cast iron skillet, properly seasoned and cared for, could last for generations. It could go from fireplace coals to hearth hook to table without damage. It could be used to fry, bake, simmer, and render fat. It required no special cleaning agents, and it improved with use, becoming more naturally non-stick and better seasoned over decades of cooking. The hearth was the thermal and social center of the cabin, and managing it through a long winter night required real skill. A fire allowed to go completely out in temperatures of -10 or 15 degrees could mean frozen water crocks, damaged root vegetables stored near the walls, and a room that took hours to reheat to a safe temperature. The technique for keeping a fire through the night without burning through the entire wood supply involved banking. The practice of covering the coals at night with a thick layer of ash, which insulated them and slowed their combustion dramatically. A properly banked fire would produce no visible flame and very little heat. But the coals beneath the ash would remain alive for 8 or 10 hours, waiting to be uncovered in the morning and fed with kindling and then larger wood until the fire rebuilt itself. This technique saved an enormous amount of firewood over the course of a winter, and was one of the first practical skills any child old enough to tend the fire would learn. Firewood itself was a year-round concern. The quantity required to heat a mountain cabin through a full Appalachian winter was staggering by modern standards. Estimates for a single-room cabin heated entirely by one fireplace range from 10 to 15 cords of wood per winter season. A cord is a stack 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 8 feet long. Cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking that volume of wood by hand, with axes and wedges and wooden mauls, required months of sustained labor spread across the spring, summer, and fall seasons. Families who waited too long to begin their woodcutting paid for it in cold and exhaustion. Those who understood the rhythm of the mountain year began their woodwork as soon as the ground thawed in spring, and did not stop until the woodpile was stacked high enough to provide confidence against even the longest possible winter. The types of wood mattered. Hard woods burned hotter and longer than softwoods. Oak, hickory, and locust were prized for overnight fires because their dense wood burned slowly and produced lasting coals. Ash was considered nearly ideal because it burned well even when still somewhat green, which could be a lifesaver in a winter that ran longer than expected. Cherry and maple burned cleanly and produced good coals. Pine and poplar, being softer, were used for kindling and for getting a fire started quickly on cold mornings, but they burned too fast to be relied upon for sustained heat. A mountain person who could look at a section of split wood and identify the species and its burning characteristics was not demonstrating an idle skill. That knowledge was woven into the practical management of the household's survival. The spring house was another piece of mountain infrastructure that served a role in winter survival that is easy to underestimate. Built over a cold spring, typically a small, low stone structure with a running channel of water flowing through its floor. The spring house functioned as a year-round refrigerator. In summer, it kept milk, butter, and other perishables at a temperature low enough to slow spoilage. In winter, the constant flow of spring water, which maintained its steady temperature regardless of the outside air, kept the interior of the spring house from freezing solid, even in severe cold snaps. Crocks of pickled vegetables, butter, and other semi-preserved foods stored there remained usable through conditions that would have destroyed the same items stored above ground. The spring house was not a luxury. It was infrastructure as essential as the root cellar or the smokehouse. herbs and medicinal plants, gathered through the summer and dried in bundles hung from the rafters of the cabin, served a function that went beyond flavor. In a world without access to doctors or pharmacies, and in communities where the nearest town might be a full day's walk away in good weather and completely unreachable in a winter storm, the ability to treat illness at home was not optional. Mountain people had developed an extensive and largely functional pharmacopoeia drawn from the plants of the region. Wild ginger, used for nausea and digestive trouble. Boneset tea, consumed at the first signs of fever. Black cohosh root, used for a variety of conditions. Poultices made from comfrey leaves for wounds and bruises. The effectiveness of these treatments varied enormously, and modern medicine has validated some while finding others to be of limited use. But in the context of a mountain winter, when a family member fell ill and the nearest help was miles away under feet of snow, having something to give, some plant, some knowledge, some action that could be taken, was itself a form of survival. The social architecture of mountain communities also played a role in winter survival that is impossible to separate from the physical. Neighbors who might live a mile or two apart through the hollow were connected by bonds of mutual obligation that functioned as a kind of informal insurance system. If a family's cow died in winter, a neighbor might share milk until they could replace it. If a man was injured and could not cut wood, the men of the surrounding homesteads would appear with their axes and fill his woodpile before the cold could take hold inside his house. This reciprocity was not charity. It was understood by everyone involved as an arrangement that could be reversed at any moment, that the family receiving help today might be the one providing it next month. The mountain ethic of self-reliance is often described as individualistic, and in many ways, it was. But it existed within a web of community obligation that made survival possible in ways that no individual, however skilled, could have managed entirely alone. There is something that the modern world has done to our understanding of winter that these mountain families would find difficult to comprehend. For most people alive today in the developed world, winter is a season of inconvenience at worst. We turn up a thermostat. We order food to be delivered. We sit under electric lights and watch screens and sleep in heated rooms and wake up to hot showers. The cold exists outside, at a distance, managed and contained by systems so complex and so invisible that we never have to think about them. We have outsourced our survival entirely, and we have done it so completely that most of us would not know where to begin if those systems failed. The families in these mountain hollows could not outsource anything. Every degree of warmth inside that cabin was a consequence of a decision made weeks or months earlier. Every bite of food in the root cellar was the result of seeds planted and tended and harvested and preserved by the same hands that were now cooking it over the same fire that they had kept alive for months. The knowledge required to maintain that life was not stored in books or on devices. It lived in the hands and the habits and the seasonal rhythms of people who had no alternative but to know it deeply. What gets lost when that knowledge disappears is not just practical information. It is a relationship with the material world, with weather, with wood, with soil, with cold and heat, and the particular smell of a root cellar in January, with the weight of a properly seasoned cast iron skillet, and the sound of cornbread pulling away from the sides of the pan as it sets. It is the felt sense of having survived something genuinely difficult, through nothing but skill and preparation and the accumulated wisdom of the people who came before. Somewhere in the old mountains, in the hollows that are harder to reach and slower to change, there are still people who carry pieces of this. Families who put up their own food, who keep a wood stove as more than decoration, who know the difference between a banking fire and a building one. They are not living in the past. They are carrying something forward, quietly, without announcement, through the winters that come every year regardless of what anyone believes about the importance of old knowledge. The cabins that never froze in those brutal Appalachian winters did not survive through luck or accident. They survived because the people inside them had paid attention, had learned, had prepared, and had understood something that remains true regardless of the century. that the cold does not negotiate. That winter comes whether you are ready or not, and that the only real answer to that has always been the same. You get ready.